Hi students, this video continues our discussion of the units of analysis and how we will use the 15 units of analysis in our course. I'm moving on to unit number 5, and this is imitation connected to plagiarism. Imitation is a classical rhetorical term and has a lot of useful applications to pedagogy. In other words, how will you use other texts and language and style for the students in their learning of the writing of English? Some faculty members, some instructors believe that you should take a genre, and this happens more in professional writing, such as a resume, and have students look at the approaches, look at the structures, and look at the word choice, and have the students imitate those, but imitate them in their own voices. Other instructors believe that you should allow for the voice of the student come out, so they don't use imitation at all. So imitation is a huge pedagogical issue in L1, but it's richly complicated in L2 because imitation is a cultural construct. And what that means is the predominant values of a culture will determine your views on imitation. For example, in collective contexts and collective cultures, imitation is a good thing because you're imitating other texts and other cultural constructs, shows that you are a part, that you depend on the culture for your definition. So you don't want to stick out from the other texts. You don't want to make your voice known or different in a collective culture. But in an individualistic culture, you do want to stick out, and imitation is bad. It's a sign of poor thinking. Now, your students won't know what approaches they take on imitation in their culture because they've never gone through this. They will just bring their cultural construct of imitation to the writing classroom, and you need to do two things as an ELL instructor. You need to make your imitation denaturalized. You need to say, we will imitate texts for the following reasons based on U.S. academic culture and prose. But you also need to help students transition from their home culture to the U.S. culture. One of these most difficult transitions is plagiarism. In more collective cultures, plagiarism is not plagiarism. Some plagiarism is plagiarism, but they're so used to borrowing, so used to imitating, because imitation is a good thing in many cultural constructs, that the students don't view it as plagiarism. But the U.S. definitions of plagiarism are based on individualism mostly, and what we call universalism, this cultural construct of property. So the students will think they're imitating sometimes when in fact they're actually plagiarizing. We have to teach plagiarism and imitation all the time in our English language ELL classrooms because it's such a difficult construct. Students will have learned something about U.S. plagiarism when they come here, but this is something that we need to explain perhaps in the context of imitation. Big issue. It's a fun issue because it unearths so many cultural values. Next is what I call writing process and English language time. Most of the writing processes and milestones in L1 U.S. writing theory is based on the U.S. culture. No, that's like no duh. What does that mean? Well, these stages of pre-writing, composing, reviewing, and revising with recursive loops, those are based on U.S. cultural values of individualism, of a universalism, of high context cultures, and what we call specific orientation. They also use many commonplaces of writing, use many commonplaces that U.S. students will understand and ELL students will not understand. Now, you have to back this up and understand that most ELLs will need more time in English and less time in the writing process in coming up with good things to say. And they bring a different capacity. They are often much more able to abstract and conceptualize the assignment much more quickly than L1s, but their language time they need much more language time. So when you think about pre-writing, you need to add more language time in pre-writing. In composing, they're going to take a lot longer to compose than your L1 students, and they have different composing problems, often with grammar, word choice, and syntax. In reviewing, they're going to have different English language needs for reviewing, probably much more time in reviewing. So this slows the process down in the English language learner terms because you need more English language time. But the concepts and the analysis are actually much quicker, and they bring such a cross-cultural view that they can capture these things more quickly. So you need to restructure the writing process in English language learner time, and we'll look at that in the readings. And moving on to correctness, grammar, and style. Most of our ELLs will come with a correctness approach to writing. Writing is not taught as a separate class and subject in most other parts of the world. The only place that it's really taught is in Western Europe, Australia, U.S. colonies, British colonies, other Western Europe countries. Now it's being taught a little more in China, but writing is not taught as a specific subject in most places, most universities in the world, most K through 12s. What that means is writing, if it's taught, is taught as correct grammar and getting the forms correct. So most of our students will come to our class with a correctness approach, but our writing classes have a communicative approach, and there's a long history of communicative competence in L2 writing. We call it the rhetorical approach. So you will need to help the ELL learners transition from a grammar and style to a communicative competence approach. And our L1 students have the same issues, but they're not as entrenched, shall we say, as our English language learners, because they've been taught writing mostly in high school, and they probably have experienced a communicative approach significantly in practical context, but in their academic context as well. So when we're looking at the readings, we're looking at how instructors handle this correctness versus communicative competence. Next is a really complicated theory with tremendous application to epistemology, to subjectivity, and to ideology. And this is the L1 culture and language transfer and relations. Pure Sapir-Whorf hypothesis means that if you're bilingual, for example, that your brain is split right down the middle. For example, I'm mostly bilingual. I'm native in English and almost entirely bilingual in Spanish. Some people would argue I have two brains. I have an English Latin America brain, and I have an English American brain, and a Spanish Latin American brain. And what that means is it's hard for my Spanish brain to talk to my English brain and vice versa. Now, for instructors, this means if you hold to this strong version of Sapir-Whorf, that means that the student's native language is strongly structuring the way that student thinks and sees and writes and communicates and thinks about himself or herself. Most people take the weak Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which means my native language predisposes me to think this way, but my brain is not split. I'm not bipolar in the language sense. I can think in Spanish or in English, and my English will structure how I speak in Spanish and write in Spanish, but I also have a Spanish that will structure my English, and so there's overlap. But we will look at the readings and we will think, how is this reading assuming that the L1 culture and language transfers or does not transfer? And this has a tremendous debate about language and subjectivity and language and reality. I'm in a position, well, the position you take on this will be parallel to the position you take on translation. Some people say that you cannot translate Ernest Hemingway into Spanish because you lose the whole cultural background of English and the 1930s and 40s and Hemingway's novels, and you just can't do it. I think that's not robust. I think you can translate anything, but there's a loss in the translation, and you have to think about how to make up for that loss, because we can get cultures to understand Hemingway in all sorts of ways, but you have to figure out what is the loss and what happens when you translate in terms of an addition, because things are changed. So that's a huge issue in L1 culture. That's a huge issue, in English language learning, because we try to understand where students are coming from, but we don't determine their capacity based on where they're coming from, but it's an influence in terms of how they perform in English. It's a really fun issue, and this is what I love about contrastive rhetoric and love about the field, is when you cross cultures and languages, you figure out approaches in composition, approaches in translation that you cannot buy just because of their one language-centered approach. Okay. Number 9, it looks like I'm going to get through number 9, and that will be the end. We'll see. Based on number 8, students are going to come to the classroom with an understanding of how you as an instructor should relate to the student. And so based on the transfer theory, what kind of relations are your English language learners expecting with you as an instructor? Now, if you're in first year composition and you're at Doña Ana Community College and these students are Generation 1-5 or Spanish dominant, and if they've spent enough time in the United States and in schools in the U.S., it's not often a difficult question despite their family backgrounds and their Mexican or Hispanic culture. But if you have a student who's in your class for the first time in the United States, that student is most likely going to believe that that instructor will treat the student exactly as that student has been treated in his or home class. They know the United States is different, but they're not quite sure. And the example I use is in Spanish. When I'm in Mexico or Latin America and they hear I'm a professor, they'll ask me, okay, what do you teach? But often they'll say it in Spanish as ¿qué dicta usted? Which means what do you dictate? And this Spanish phrase has at its roots a real high power distance culture that teachers dictate. They don't collaborate with their students at a more egalitarian level. So the students will bring often this sense of how the instructor relates to the students from their home culture, but then they know the United States is different and they're willing to work. But you cannot expect students to know exactly how you approach your relationships with them, and they're often taken aback when you treat them as equals. That often confuses students from more authoritative or collective cultures. So you'll need to make sure that you are denaturalized and say, I'm the instructor, and in U.S. culture, in my classroom, I want to make this as equal as possible if that's your choice. Or if you want to say, I'm the instructor, I know, and you structure it more formally, it's up to you, but you need to make explicit your expectations. Now, as Severino talks about really clearly, and as we'll explore in this class, the literature and the pedagogy in English language learners is replete with discussions of how do you respond to students. You're going to have a classroom in English 111M with students from 8 cultures. And each student is used to a different way for you to respond in writing to them. This makes teaching ELL writing so difficult, but also so much fun, because you understand where students are coming from and you kind of bridge your expectations to their expectations. So, okay, we finished units 4 through 9. I hope this is starting to make sense. I look forward to your discussions.